Welcome to the Age of Fission radio show with your host, Lonnie Clark, where we constantly remind you that love is greater than fear and happiness is resistance. Good evening. This is your host, Lonnie Clark, with the Age of Fission radio show. I want to thank you for joining us tonight. I am actually going to be reading, I don't know if it's going to be the last segment of Dr. Helen Caldicott's book, The New Nuclear Danger, George W. Bush's Military-Industrial Complex. We are on page 173, and I want to thank those of you who join us on a regular basis and who are my subscribers on YouTube. You know, we're going to persist. I say happiness is resistance, and I mean it. I am going to persist on this issue because we need to face the dangers that are in front of us. We need to understand what's going on. Just this last week, President Trump rolled out officially the Star Wars program. You can catch those podcasts on YouTube. Not on YouTube. Well, you can get them on YouTube, actually. They are on YouTube. C-SPAN has them. C-SPAN has a YouTube channel, but you can watch C-SPAN or go to their internet website and just click in Space Force. And boom, you are going to see that the president rolled out that they are going full steam ahead with every single thing and worse that Dr. Caldicott talked about in this book. So I appreciate people being willing to hear this. Let's get right to the book. We're on page 173. And we will, actually what I'll do is I'll read the very bottom of the page of 172 at the beginning of the last paragraph. That'll bring us up to speed on where we left off. In November 2000, Putin proposed a massive cut in the level of strategic weapons to 1,000 or less, saying there would be no pause in nuclear disarmament. He said a 1,500 level could be reached by 2008, but only on condition that the U.S. did not proceed with its missile defense. Well, they did. That's exactly what got rolled out this week. Russia cannot afford its annual spending of $5.1 billion on defense, compared with the U.S. expenditure of $310 billion. That's way more now. That's a small number these days. I think we just passed a military budget in 2019 or 18 of $979 billion. Thank you, President. I'm not going to say what he is. You know what, grabber. To this end, Putin also approved a military reform program to cut his 3 million military personnel by 600,000. But because both sides recognize the inherent danger of the ongoing launch on warning posture, on December 16, 2000, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright and Foreign Prime Minister Igor Ignov signed an agreement to strengthen cooperation on preventing accidental missile launches on both sides by expanding an early warning center where both sides can exchange information. However, the agreement, which still stands, will not cover missiles launched at combat, and either government can withhold advance information of certain space flights for national security reasons. Still, as a direct result of the U.S. election, Russia has changed its posture. Putin warned that the deployment of a national missile defense shield and NATO's continued expansion into Eastern Europe could irreparably damage global stability and the architecture of international relations. You know, they just want us to live in crisis, to feel anxiety all the time. This is the same language they were talking about 15 years ago, only now we've got it on steroids with the traitor in the White House. Thus, in January 2001, just after Bush was inaugurated, the Kremlin shelved its plans for radical cuts in its military structures. Soon thereafter, Russia announced that it would double its defense spending over the next 10 years if Washington decided to go ahead with its missile defense shield. During the same week, however, Putin wrote a letter to President Bush proposing broader Russian-American cooperation and setting out the major issues on which he believes the two countries can cooperate. When Russia and the U.S. act jointly or on parallel tracks, decisions meeting the interests of peace and international stability may be reached, he said, and affirmed that Russia wants warm relations with the United States. But Bush signaled that he will pay even less attention to Russian foreign policy concerns than did Clinton, who ignored Russians' protest about the expansion of NATO and the Cold War against Yugoslavia. And the war against Yugoslavia. However, at the November 1st Crawford Ranch meeting in Texas between Bush and Putin, there was a post-September 11th magnanimity that pervaded the president's relationship, with Bush offering to reduce the U.S. strategic nuclear weapons arsenal down to between 1,700 and 2,200 within the next 10 years. Putin did not give an immediate response. Moscow analysts see Cheney, Rumsfeld, Powell, and Rice as hawks from a bygone era. These are people who see themselves as victors in the Cold War, according to Alexander Goltz, a military commentator for the news magazine Itogi. The Kremlin and the generals are flattered by that, because it reminds them of the days of the USSR when they were a great power. But the new American administration is making a very strong and negative impact on our military, unquote. Concerned about the military shield, China and Russia hastily convened a meeting on January 3, 2001, in which they worked on a treaty to proclaim their friendship while privately reassuring the U.S. they will seek closer ties with them. Jonathan Pollock, chairman of the Strategic Research Department at the Naval War College, says the treaty is a significant move in Sino-Russian ties and that such reflects Beijing's and Moscow's deep concern about Bush and his people. James Mulvenon, a security expert at the Rand Corporation, echoed these sentiments. Quote, "The United States, through incompetence and ham-handed policy making, has effectively driven China and Russia together. NMD is a perfect example. By not having a coordinated policy vis-a-vis the Europeans and the Russians, we let the Chinese play them off against us. There is an enormous resonance in both countries for blaming problems on American hegemony, and we have done nothing to drive a wedge between them." I always have the hardest time with that word, hegemony. Anyways, you know what that means. That means like one country who has massive dominance over everybody else. Like the United States was the leader of the free world before Trump destroyed our country. The pact will almost certainly add fuel to the Wolfowitz clan stance. It will now be easy to convince the American people that China and Russia threaten the very existence of America with their newfound friendship and their combined nuclear arsenals. This dynamic will then reinforce exactly what the neoconservatives have been saying, and Star Wars will be legitimized. Ding, 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 ding. It is legitimized. New subtitle. China and the Bush administration. What is China's response to Bush and Star Wars, apart from the Sino-Russian treaty, which at this stage is vague in its specific objectives? China's view of America has taken a radical turn since 1998, when in its second white paper on national defense, it mentioned the United States 10 times, each in a positive fashion. In September 2000, its third white paper mentions the U.S. 13 times. All save 2 of the references are negative. China's attitude has been soured by events in recent years, including the expansion of NATO, the strengthening of the U.S.-Japan military relationship, and congressional report charging Chinese nationalists with 2 decades of espionage in the U.S., NMD, and the Allied bombing of a Chinese embassy in Yugoslavia, which killed 3 of their journalists. The bombing prompted serious internal debate about whether China should accelerate its military spending. However, the Central Committee decided to reaffirm their former emphasis on economic development. American belligerence toward China has become uncomfortable. On a visit to Australia in July 2000, former Secretary of Defense William Cohen, having just left China, urged Australia to increase its military spending to ensure that its forces could support the U.S. if there were to be a war with China over Taiwan. Republican Tom DeLay, House Majority Whip, recently boasted of how he confronted the Chinese ambassador on Meet the Press. He grabbed the ambassador's hand as if to shake it, but instead squeezed it hard, yanked the ambassador close to him, and warned him not to underestimate the resolve of the American people. The ambassador, humiliated, left immediately. Wow. And Tom DeLay actually went to jail. He was a criminal. Wow. China is not a military threat to America. With a population of 1.2 billion and a rapidly changing political arena moving from authoritarian communism to some form of free enterprise capitalism, it's still communism, folks. It's not just capitalism. China's leaders have much to occupy their minds while providing food, education, and a decent standard of living for their people. The last thing that China needs is to divert money and attention to a new nuclear or conventional arms race in their region. But that is the dynamic that Bush is about to set up. If Congress approves the full Star Wars scenario, China will be forced to build more ballistic missiles to overcome America's missile defense. In fact, as noted previously, the U.S. intelligence agency's report, Foreign Responses to U.S. National Missile Defense Deployment, predicted just this. But there is more at stake. The U.S. is about to deploy theater missile defense systems in Japan, South Korea, and possibly Taiwan, because the TMD is legitimate under the ABM Treaty. China will then be forced to build up her intermediate-range nuclear missile forces to overload the TMD system. Theoretically, these missiles could hit targets in India, an old enemy of China. The pro-nuclear regime in India will react badly to these developments and will be goaded into an ongoing nuclear arms race with China. Then what will nuclear Pakistan do? It will be pushed into an ongoing nuclear arms race against India, siding with its ally China. However, since the American attack on Afghanistan, there is huge dissent in the streets of Pakistan amongst the Muslim fundamentalists who support the Taliban and Osama bin Laden. These people also have a significant presence within the Pakistani military. There is a distinct prospect that if there were a civil war in Pakistan, they could gain the upper hand in the military and thereby control 20 to 30 nuclear weapons that Pakistan has built over the past decade. This poses a terrifying prospect. Arch enemies of the nuclear-armed India, themselves armed with nuclear weapons. Wow. There's also Japan, a country with the third largest military in the world, with the world's most advanced technological base, a country with an aggressive past and huge stockpiles of pure plutonium on the cusp of nuclearization. With a week's notice, Japan could construct nuclear weapons if it decided to. Japan maintains the third largest military in the world because it can legally spend only 1% of its GNP on weapons, but it has a huge GNP. China is well aware of these possibilities, and Japan is an old enemy of China. The nuclearization of China could then trigger a nuclear arms race between South Korea and Japan, two countries with deep enmities. Taiwan is officially a part of China since Nixon's visit in the early 70s. However, animosity between China and Taiwan remains, and right-wing Republicans are enthusiastically adding fuel to this smoldering fire. In September 2000, the U.S. signed a $1.3 billion arms deal with Taiwan, including the sale of 200 AMRAAM missiles, not to be made available unless China introduces a similar weapon system, an arrangement that is meant to signify America's pledge not to introduce new offensive military capabilities into Asia. But on April 1st, 2001, an international incident induced in the Chinese-American relationship. A Chinese pilot collided with a U.S. spy plane. A Chinese pilot collided with a U.S. spy plane off the coast of China, forcing the U.S. plane to land on Hainan, the Chinese island. The Chinese were furious that Americans were spying just off their coast, and the U.S. was furious because the Chinese held the 24-member crew for 11 days. I don't remember that. Do you guys? Despite the provocation and damage to U.S.-Chinese relations caused by this incident, the flight of the spy planes must continue, according to Secretary Rumsfeld. Oh, God, what an evil man. This episode sharply increased tensions just before the Bush administration was to decide whether to spend more military equipment in Taiwan. China was particularly concerned that Taiwan not obtain Aegis ships, which are an integral component of a theater missile defense system. Eventually, on April 24, 2001, the Bush administration announced that it would sell 12 P-3 Orion planes to enable Taiwan to patrol at sea and hunt for submarines, 4 Kidd-class destroyers that carry powerful sonar equipment to hunt for submarines and sub-hunting helicopters, and 8 new diesel subs to be made in Germany and the Netherlands. However, these countries have announced their reluctance to assist the U.S. arming of Taiwan. The Chinese find that the submarines to be particularly provocative. For the moment, Bush has postponed the decision to equip Taiwan with Aegis ships and Patriot PAC-3 anti-missile batteries. Let me check the time because I took my glasses off. We're at 17 minutes. Okay. To make matters worse, 2 days after this decision was announced, President Bush declared that the United States would do whatever it takes to help Taiwan defend itself, including the use of military force. This statement was a distinct departure from the long-standing policy of American strategic ambiguity towards Taiwan, expressing a strong interest in that country's security while avoiding an outright promise to go to war in its defense. Although Bush tried to backpedal in subsequent interviews, his statement was consistent with the hardline Republican policy on China, whose platform states that America will help Taiwan defend itself. Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz and Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage have called for the strategic ambiguity to be abandoned completely. Wow. Other nations were shocked and incensed about the change of strategy. Critical editors abounded in the European and Australian press. The Taiwanese themselves admit that they were close to China economically, with businesses on both sides involved in huge economic deals. China has evolved into Taiwan's... Did I skip a page? No. No, I think I did. No, I didn't. Sorry about that, you guys. I'll go back. Let me get back to the beginning of the sentence. The Taiwanese themselves admit that they were close to China economically, with business on both sides involved in huge economic deals. China has evolved into Taiwan's second largest market for trade and investment. 40% of Taiwan's foreign investment is in China. Students across the Taiwanese Straits go to Chinese medical schools and universities. It is the Taiwan military, like the U.S. military, that is pushing for these weapons and influencing foreign policy. As Taiwan becomes more militarized, China may conclude that the U.S. is restoring a mutual defense pact with Taiwan, an agreement that fell by the wayside in 1979 when Washington normalized diplomatic relations with Beijing and adopted a one-China policy, recognizing the Chinese government as legitimate for Taiwan. With TMD systems deployed in China, South Africa, Taiwan, and possibly Australia, a compliant and peaceful U.S. ally, China will begin to feel encircled by military hostility. As an aside, TMD systems do not pose as much of a threat to Russia as they do to China. Russia's ICBMs are located deep within their continental interior, so interceptor rockets launched from coastal waters, as currently proposed, will not achieve the velocity necessary to take out Russian missiles in their boost phase. China is the Pentagon's premier villain, according to the study conducted by the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, called Asia 2025. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, the major Pentagon war games increasingly take place in Asia. According to the report, the effort now is for the U.S. to manage the rise of China as a great power, and the Pentagon is concentrating and expanding on naval, air, and space power in the Pacific region. They see China as a force for instability and a constant competitor. Wow. The Pentagon is concerned with the emergence of China as the greatest regional threat to the United States, the lack of forward operating bases in Southeast Asia and South Asia if the U.S. is to remain a key player in these regions, the emerging strategic potential of India, and the need at all costs to prevent China's India alliance. They envision 5 possible scenarios where China could be a threat, including an unstable China scenario, a strong China, a new South Asian order, where India could either become an ally or an opponent of China, an Asian realigned scenario, or the new Sino-Indian condominium scenario. There is a major conflict in the U.S. between engagement and containment of China. Instead of military confrontation, Clinton's policy was to engage China so that the U.S. business interests could exploit the China market. He encouraged China's entry into the World Trade Organization so that it would end its protectionist trade policies, allowing U.S. corporations full access to Chinese resources. The Pentagon was unhappy with this approach, which strengthened both China economically and strategically. As Walden Bayo said, the Asia 2025 study speaks volumes to the Pentagon's grim determination to counter any significant threat to U.S. strategic hegemony in Asia. Another Pentagon study, the 2001 Quadrennial Defense Review, also concentrates on China. While it continues to reiterate the U.S. policy of maintaining the ability to fight 2 conventional wars simultaneously, it states that the threat from Iraq and North Korea are fading, negating the Rumsfeld theory that legitimizes Star Wars. The review emphasizes the so-called China threat, stating that China should be the new focus of the U.S. military force structure, including its troop deployments, weapons procurement, research and development. This policy ensures ever-increasing funding for the Pentagon's budget. But China uses its People's Liberation Army not for international purposes, but to alleviate domestic problems such as floods and fires, to quell internal disputes such as Xinjiang and Tibet, and for border disputes. Land forces are currently being reduced by hundreds of thousands. Even if Taiwan declares independence and America attempts to back Taiwan in its move, resulting in an armed conflict, China has virtually no amphibious forces able to attack Taiwan. It would prefer to spend its resources caring for the needs of its 1.3 billion people, and it has little interest in weapons construction. The risk of killing fellow Chinese and of provoking economic isolation and military failure would most likely result in China's powerful wooing of Taiwan instead. As Dr. Nicholas Berry, senior analyst at the Center for Defense Information, writes, Americans who see China as the new imperialistic threat need to review the historical record. Unless history is meaningless as a predictor of events, China will not seek empire. As long as China's periphery is secure and no country is prepared to attack it, the PLA will carry out its internal and defensive tasks, including putting pressure on Taiwan not to leave the fold, unquote. In warning the Bush administration not to include Taiwan in any missile defense systems, China urged the U.S. to desist from any arms sales to that country. If the United States is bent on its plan to include Taiwan in its TMD system, it will constitute a wanton interference and threat to Chinese sovereignty and security, it said, meaning that if forced to by the U.S. policy, it will arm itself appropriately to fight a military aggressive Taiwan. This statement was issued only hours after Colin Powell opined that China should not now regard itself. This statement was issued only hours after Colin Powell opined that China should not now be regarded as a strategic partner as it had during the Clinton administration. The Air Force at this moment is upgrading its bases in Guam and on Wake Island in the Pacific to handle more B-1 and B-2 bombers. They are repositioning cruise missiles in Guam, and American TMD is being widely promoted throughout the region. The Navy is expected to nearly double its presence in the Pacific within the next few years. The Pentagon has assigned over 230,000 military personnel, including the Pacific Fleet, to the region. Leaked internal documents dated January 29, 1998, show that the U.S. Naval Security Group Command entered into a host nation partnership at the Joint Defense Facility in Pine Gap in Australia. Wow. Where they are currently monitoring movements and telecommunications of traffic of warships of naval vessels in Pakistan, India, Indonesia, China, and North Korea. Let me read that again. Shows that the U.S. Naval Security Group Command entered into a host nation partnership at the Joint Defense Facility at Pine Gap in Australia. Wow. So Australia and the U.S. are in on spying on all these people. China, the dominant country in the South China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, and the Sea of Japan, is obviously of most interest to the U.S. and intelligence officials. American Global Imperialism. Chalmers Johnson, in a new book, Blowback, The Costs and Consequences of the American Empire, argues that instead of demobilizing at the end of the Cold War, the U.S. imprudently committed itself to maintaining a global empire, unquote. He believes that it is time to discuss how the Cold War helped to conceal an American imperial project, and that America should by rights remove itself from South Korea and from its military bases in Japan, while unilaterally drastically cutting its nuclear forces and declaring a no first use policy. Yeah, well, we did exactly the opposite. That Star Wars things that you can catch on C-SPAN actually declared they are going to have a first strike policy. American historian Paul Kennedy calls U.S. global dominance imperial overreach and says that the maps of major U.S. force deployments around the world look extraordinarily similar to the chain of fleet and bases and garrisons possessed by that former great power, Great Britain, at the end of its strategic overreach. The British today are in a pickle. Tony Blair worked well with Clinton, but he will be under particular pressure to cooperate with his new-look American allies, even while knowing that if he allows the Fylingdale radar station on the North York Moors National Park to be expanded for Star Wars, he will have a civil uprising on his hands. Fylingdale neighbors realize that they will become one of the targets of America's mad plans. As retired geologist Peter Wood said, if this installation becomes a target for hostile action, it would be like William the Conqueror all over again, who starved to death half the population a millennium ago on the North York Moors. Imagine us going to you and asking to put up a radar station in the middle of Yosemite National Park just to protect Britain. Woods added, "Do you think the United States would just say okay? If Blair permits Fylingdale Station upgrade, plus another at Menwith Hill, he will be at odds with his European colleagues and many within his own party. Since the summer of 2000, 2 white globes have been installed at Fylingdale, supposedly for tracking satellites. Inevitably, these stations will be aggressively picketed by the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, Greenpeace, and the North Yorkshire branch of the Women's Institute, who are deeply concerned about the despoilization of the countryside. It will be the Greenham Commons all over again. Thousands of women set up camp at Greenham Common and staged protests during the 80s against the deployment of American cruise missiles on the Common. They prevailed and the missiles were removed. France is an opponent of NMD. During Bush's inauguration, French Prime Minister Alain Richard flew to Moscow for talks about the proposed U.S. NMD plan, which Bush said would provide protection for America's allies. French analyst Camille Grand said the NMD could stand for no more disarmament. And French Foreign Minister Hubert Védrine said that it is not very serious to think that states such as North Korea, Iran, Libya, or Iraq could threaten the world's only superpower, calling these threats microscopic or theoretical. According to Hugo Young of The Guardian, a quiet turmoil of alarm has gripped the Foreign Office and Ministry of Defense for months in Britain. They are now facing a Washington being peopled. That doesn't understand this. They are now facing a Washington being peopled by voices that make a different analysis, scornful of Russia, arrogant about China, intolerant of European sensitivities, overwhelmingly impressed by the sense of defending U.S. territory, and confident that the practical failure of NMD so far, like the untested capabilities of the Boost Phase project, were mere blips on the relentless American path toward technological mastery. If Blair decides to support NMD, Young says, it will create the deepest rupture in continental Europe. Greenland, a Danish protectorate, where another radar station at Thule will need upgrading, has said the unproven concept of NMD will sow the seeds of global instability and pitch the country unwillingly into the center of a new Cold War. The Thule station is also presently part of the U.S. early warning system. Almost all European countries are adamantly opposed to any form of Star Wars and are deeply concerned about the direction in which this new president is taking the world. Meanwhile, Europe is uncomfortable about the way NATO is structured. During the Kosovo War, the Europeans had little to say about how the conflict was conducted. America had sole access to most of the space-based information flow, deciding how and when the 78-day operation would proceed. Pre-September 11, Europe was fed up with its sycophantic position in relation to the U.S., which regularly ignored the United Nations and which intervened unilaterally in the Sudan, Afghanistan, and Iraq without consulting its closest allies. When it did intervene with other nations, it took a military stand that allowed for no American casualties, which made it a much more hindrance than a help. As the Guardian editorial said, Saving Private Ryan has become the leitmotif of the whole operation. The leitmotif. I wonder what that means, leitmotif. That's a new word for me. If anybody knows, you can leave it in the comments. I'm going to look it up. September 11th changed many of these dynamics. The whole world was appalled by the attacks upon America, and a new international spirit of cooperation brought most nations of the world together to support America in its tragedy in the time of need. Furthermore, new alliances were quickly formed to support the war in Afghanistan, and although much of the war was fought from the air, causing many thousands of civilian casualties, eventually American troops were brought in at the end of the mopping up operations. Yeah, well, I guess we're still mopping up. Is that the issue here? Consequently, in November 2001, Europe decided to set up its own military and peacekeeping force, pledging 60,000 troops and its own equipment by 2003. The first European military initiative since the end of the Cold War will involve additional military spending and will give the Europeans the ability to operate without the United States. The United States is nervous that the EU, or the European Union, peacekeeping force may surpass and ultimately become more important than NATO, a move that Washington would strongly oppose. Former Secretary of Defense William Cohen warned, there will be no EU caucus in NATO. If they try or are desirous of a separate operational planning capability, separate and distinct from NATO itself, then that is going to weaken ties between the U.S. and NATO and the EU. The Pentagon is not easily going to forgo its European footing. On December 1, 2000, it released the strategy report for Europe and NATO entitled Strengthening Transatlantic Security, which states that the U.S. will continue its reliance on deterrence as a cornerstone of security while maintaining a commitment to American nuclear forces in Europe. Wow. It calls for NATO enlargement, saying that the U.S. military presence in Europe plays a critical role in protecting our economic interests. It also states that overall the United States has embarked on its largest sustained increase in defense spending in 15 years, and that they are planning the extinction, Freudian slip there, folks, and that they are planning the execution of joint and multinational military operations in nuclear, biological, and chemical environments. Wow, that makes chills go up my spine. Referring to Russia, the report adds, the transatlantic community cannot be truly secure if its enormous nuclear-armed neighbor, with its rich human and natural resources, withdraws behind a curtain of hostility and authoritarian rule or collapses economically. This provocative statement seems to go counter to President Putin's numerous conciliatory overtures of the United States and his overtures to rapidly reduce bilaterally the strategic arsenals. New subtitle, Business Are Us. The world has gone backward since 1987, when Reagan and Gorbachev sat in an intimate sitting room in the house in Reykjavik, Iceland, and almost agreed to eliminate nuclear weapons between the superpowers, an agreement that failed when Reagan refused to go his Star Wars project. General Henry Shelton, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, told Congress in September 2000 that the services would need significant increases in spending in the coming years, suggesting that this could consume a large part of the current budget surplus, and boy, it did. 19 years later, we have a multi-trillion-dollar deficit. He endorsed a study from the Congressional Budget Office that called for an increase in spending on new weapons from $60 billion to $90 billion annually. Bush has already pledged to spend $45 billion more on military over the next 10 years, plus at least another $70 billion on Star Wars. However, since September 11, 2001 attack, the Pentagon and the military-industrial complex have cynically used these terrible events to capitalize on the trauma and despair of the American people and Congress. Within days, Congress appropriated a $60 billion emergency spending package for reconstruction and combating terrorism. The greatest beneficiaries will be weapons manufacturers such as Raytheon and Lockheed Martin. Interestingly, Among a very few companies that showed increased stock prices the week the market reopened on September 17 were Raytheon, up 37%, Alliant Tech Systems, up 23.5%, and Northrop Grumman, up 21.2%. Cha-ching! Star Wars corporations used this opportunity to push their wares on Capitol Hill with homilies such as, "Just because you have assurances against theft doesn't mean you shouldn't buy fire insurance." The Democrats backed off their fight against NMD tests and other actions that would violate the ABM treaty in the wake of September 11th. So compliant has the Congress become that Christopher Helen from the Center for Defense Information suggested that the military spending for 2002 could reach $375 billion, a $66 billion increase over 2001, and some right-wing analysts, such as Lauren Thompson at the Lexington Institute, suggest Congress may now be willing to push the Pentagon budget to $400 billion per year and or more. And or more is right. Our budget this last year was $975 billion, almost $1 trillion on the military approved in 2018. The NMD program stands to benefit the most, followed by the scandal-plagued V-22 Osprey aircraft in the Republican Representative Kurt Weldon's district in Pennsylvania, Lockheed Martin's F-22 pushed by the Texas and Georgia delegations, Northrop Grumman's B-2 pushed by the Democratic Representative Norm Dix from Washington, and Republican Representative Ron Duke Cunningham from California, at more than $2 billion per plane. $2 billion per plane? What? Wow. Okay. Let's get back to the book. My shock. I don't know about you guys, but that shocked me. $2 billion per plane. In the wake of September 11th attacks, the Bush administration is to accelerate weapons sales in the Middle East and South Asia, including Lockheed Martin F-16s to Oman and the United Arab Emirates, and other weapons systems to Egypt and Pakistan. Under the banner Business Are Us, the Pentagon hosts a paper on their website proclaiming that they are America's largest company, the next being Exxon with a budget of $165 billion. Worth With 5.1 million employees, the Pentagon is the largest employer. It maintains 600 fixed facilities nationwide, with more than 40,000 properties and 18 million acres of land. It stations employees in 130 countries out of a total of 178 countries. Its global presence is ubiquitous. 5.1 million employees. America is a nation that spends only 6 cents out of every dollar on educating its children and 4 cents on health care for every 50 cents it spends on military-industrial complex. Overall, the Pentagon's $310 billion per year dwarfs the $44.5 billion for the Education Department and the $20.3 billion for the National Institutes of Health. $310 billion for the military, $44 billion for education, $20 billion for health. That is an outrage. Globally, the annual military expenditure stands at $780 billion. The annual amount required to provide global health care, eliminating starvation, malnutrition, provide clean water and shelter for all, remove landmines, eliminate nuclear weapons, stop deforestation, prevent global warming, ozone depletion and acid rain, retire the paralyzing debt of developing nations, prevent soil erosion, produce safe, clean energy, stop overpopulation, and eliminate illiteracy is only 1/3 of that amount. $237.5 billion. Oh my God, that is insane. And they know this, and they're not doing it. Back to the book. In his farewell speech in January 1961, President Eisenhower warned, quote, "In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether it be sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic process," unquote. Well, we are there, sir. They didn't take your advice. This book illustrates in detail that these prophetic predictions have come to pass. We need to put aside our need for superiority over others, our need for to be militarily powerful. America has excellent skills at conflict resolution. These must be deployed. The Pentagon needs to be virtually dismantled. Amalgamating with the United Nations, its military expertise needs to be quietly and efficiently used for peacekeeping operations around the world. Currently, there are now 68 low-intensity wars in the world demanding attention. This is 2002. After the September 11th terrorist attack on the United States, there was much discussion about what the response should be. I carefully advocated during my U.S. lecture tour over the next 2 weeks that the international community should seek cooperatively together, including all the intelligence organizations, MI5, MI6, Mossad, the FBI, CIA, NSA, to identify, locate, and capture these international terrorists and bring them to trial before an international court of justice, as were their predecessors, the Nazis. It is not necessary for America to proclaim itself the most powerful and the greatest nation on earth. It needs to demonstrate these qualities. As Edmund Burke said 2 centuries ago, the only way evil can flourish is for good men to do nothing. It is up to the men and women of the world to act. I would therefore like to address the men and women of America. You belong to the most powerful nation on earth, an immensely wealthy country, populated by people who want to live their lives with compassion and integrity. You have a great and noble task ahead of you. Each of you can be as powerful as the most powerful person who ever lived. If you or your child were threatened with a lethal disease, you would do everything in your power to save that life. This is the analogy you must now apply to the planet, and in particular to your country. America has the power and resources to reverse global warming, to save the ozone layer, to prevent chemical pollution, to stop deforestation, to curb the human overpopulation problem, and to prevent the rape of space. The money that America invests in killing must now be redirected urgently to the preservation of life. America must rise to its full moral and spiritual height to reach its intended destiny, the nation that saved the world. In a similar vein, the people of Europe must resist the constant call from America to arm and rearm. So too the people of Canada, of Australia, and indeed all the people of the world. We cannot continue to behave as primitive animals, killing for pleasure, killing for money, killing for religious imperatives, killing for greed and territory imperative. Conflict resolution and peacekeeping must be our new priorities. Even after the catastrophe of September 11, 2001, it is still inappropriate to rush off and kill thousands of innocent people for revenge. The only reaction that a civilized nation should be, as mentioned above, to work together with the international community to bring these criminals to justice. Never forget that thousands of nuclear weapons remain continuously on hair trigger alert. Any disturbance of the international situation could trigger their launch and cast us into the pall of conflagration and nuclear winter. You cannot simultaneously prevent and prepare for war. The very prevention of war requires more faith, courage, and resolution than are needed to prepare for war. And that is a quote from Albert Einstein. And that, my dear friends, is the end of the book. Woohoo! We made it. Let me see how long I've been doing this. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us and sticking with us in this reading. It's been really a pleasure to read to you. And I hope you come back and join our radio show. I hope you enjoy this week's version of Fuku Friday with Dave Parrish. Please subscribe to Dave Parrish's YouTube channel at DaveParrish and to my YouTube channel on Nutzforart, Nutzfoart. You'll see a picture of a little brook that I took up at Mount Pisgah. Put your courage feet on, you guys, and we will talk to you next week.
8 minutes is all we have to do for our special edition of the Fuku Friday Happy Hour Hangout. Hi guys, it's Dave here from Operation Save the Earth, and this is the Fuku Friday Happy Hour Hangout for January 18th, 2019. And it's a special edition of the show. We're doing it live here in downtown Phoenix, one of my favorite places to shoot, and very special guests from Samadhi Sea of Wisdom. It's Michael and Alice. Thank you guys for being here today. What I want to be able to talk to you guys, the Fuku Fighters, about here today is, what it is that the message has been all about this whole time. I've been working with Michael and Allie for many years now about, finding about centeredness and using meditation. And, I know, everyone's like, it's kind of airy-fairy stuff, but I'm here to tell you, right? If you look at the old Fuku Friday shows compared to the new Fuku Friday shows, you'll see the difference, and the difference is because I've been working with these guys, okay? So I want them to explain to you what it is that Samadhi Sea of Wisdom is and what it does, and I believe me, you don't need me to tell you how great they are. You can just, see for yourself. Michael, Allie, go ahead and take it away.
Well, hi everybody. To me, Samadhi means loving yourself and connecting that heart with the mind. That to me is the most important thing, that we are connected and we love ourselves. If we can't love ourselves, we can't love anybody else, and that's what starts for me anyway.
Exactly. And Michael?
Well, we all look for identity with what other people got to say, think, or believe. But Samadhi's about finding yourself and finding your identity so you can bring your identity alive, your true identity, which is your purpose, your passion, your gift, your talent that you're here to give to the world.
That's very well put, Michael. And I can tell you, folks, from what I've learned from Michael and Alice over the years, it's exponential. I've been practicing meditation for my whole life. These guys helped me take that whole thing to the next level and, be able to be present in the infinite. And that's, I can't even express to you what that's like, So, I mean, if you, need somebody to talk to, need something to work out for yourself, and you're not really sure how to get there, call these guys because they can get you there, okay? I can guarantee you that. So what we want to be able to do is tie this back into Fukushima here today and talk about what we've been talking about all year so far. Here in 2019, it's a next chapter year, right? So what we're doing is we're all turning the page together and we're writing this story together. And like we talked about in our session this week, it's all about taking care of each other, right? And, the victims of Fukushima aren't just there in Japan. They're, everywhere in the world, right? So what these guys have been able to teach me is I've been able to teach you guys. So that's really, what it's been all about. So, Michael, can we talk about compassion and the responsibility that it is that, to actually have compassion and taking care of other people?
Sure. The one thing I want to give a great, great big thank you to my partner, to my wife, because she literally living it taught me what compassion is. See, we could read all about it, we can study it, but the thing about it is we're just talking about it. And the thing about with me, what compassion is to me is what compassion am I giving to myself? Because if I don't have compassion with myself, and what is compassion? It's the unity of the passion that exists within you. And when you can merge that within you, you can see the compassion in others. See, we're all looking for compassion out there. When we forget, it's already inside of us. Just touch your heart, and you'll see that your heart is loving you in every moment. But you forget that. We forget that because we are looking outside of ourselves. So, to make it brief, is that I looked up the definition of compassion, and may I share really briefly?
Sure.
And as he's looking that up,
Yes.
you cannot get two more passionate men right here, because we know that Dave is very passionate about what he does for this world. Michael, in his area, is very, very passionate. So when you unite and you can have that, like Michael's going to describe right now, that compassion, wow, it's explosive. So go ahead, Michael.
Sure. Thank you. Well, the most ancient meaning that I can get from compassion, and that's very important, is the Greek sympathia. It's sympathy. It's literally sharing of affliction or suffering with another. But let's go even deeper. Are you sharing your affliction with yourself, or are you judging it? Are you embracing your affliction, that it's here to remind you of something, that it's here to point you back to yourself? Because you're not willing to humble yourself, life is going to humble you. So compassion is, are you willing to humble yourself? Therefore, you can bring more humbleness and compassion and love in your world. Because that's the gift that you came to do. That's what I see in Dave. That's what I see in Alice. And listen to this. The more compassion you can have for yourself, the more you will be a teacher as a beacon of an example of bringing the truth, not by teaching it, but by living it. And that is a more powerful way, because we want to learn online, we want to learn all these things, but we don't apply it. And you're here with a special purpose, a special passion, a unique ability, unique talents, gifts, and capabilities that you're robbing yourself if you don't take the time to see the unity within yourself, because that's what the mind and the heart is here to do. They're not here to compete against each other. They're here to unite inside of you. Therefore, you can bring the true gift of the essence of who you are by bringing your truth. Because Dave has his truth, Ali has her truth, and everybody has their truth. And when we argue about whose truth is true, then we're just dividing and separating. And therefore, we keep repeating what we don't want, instead of allowing everyone to be who they are and allowing their process and respecting their process by focusing on your process. And that is being selfish to truly be selfless, and that is compassion.
Now, Michael, what you said in the definition there, you mentioned sharing.
Sharing.
Right? Now, sharing the suffering of others,
Yes.
that's something that the Fuku fighters have been doing this whole time, right, guys? So the lesson that we're trying to spread to you here today is, you got to take care of yourself before you can take care of anybody else, right? That's number one key, all right? So you have to tune into that. And the responsibility of taking on that burden, it's massive, right? If you aren't willing to go inside and have that responsibility for yourself, you're never going to get there for somebody else, right? So that's really the lesson that we want to be able to share to you. And here's the thing, guys. At the end of every show, I always tell you, go check out our website at www.operationsavetheearth.com. Of course, that's where you begin your journey. But today, I'm telling you, go check out what Samadhi is doing. Michael, do you have information like a Facebook or Instagram or anything like that?
Sure.
That people can sign up and check out and see what you guys are up to.
Yes. First of all, I'd like to say thank you to you. Thank you to you, because this work is not easy, guys. It's simple, but it's not easy, and it's well worth it. And Dave, we've seen Dave's transformation from the first day that we met, that we reflected each other, right? And we've learned so much from each other that we've enjoyed our transformation together. And the one thing that, thank you, Dave, again, once again.
Business card, do you want to tell them how to get a hold of us?
Yes.
Okay, so here's our business card.
Maybe if you hold it up, you can take a still shot of it, hold it still for them. There's so much on there.
Is that clear?
Not if you can read it. get it focus. There you go.
That's the
Yeah.
Okay, so
Check them out on Facebook.
And maybe, Dave, what you could do is at the
include
end,
the links.
go ahead and put
Yes.
the links on there
Yep.
for us. And you can text us, message us, find us on Facebook. We have our videos on there as well.
Exactly. Guys, that's it for this week. And I want to thank Samadhi Sea of Wisdom, not just for showing up today, but for showing up week after week after week for me, because I sure as heck have gotten so much from these guys, all right? So, hey, Fuku Fighters, do the right thing. Check these guys out, all right? Until next time, this is Dave saying peace and good fortune to everyone. Take care till then.
The Age of Fission radio show brings you book readings, pertinent articles, interviews with both activists and victims of nuclear and environmental contamination. We strive to deliver only the facts from reliable sources. We want to remind you that love is greater than fear, and happiness is resistance. Our dedication to love and happiness paves the road for innovation and healing. As we face our harsh reality, let us hold each other up and rejoice in our humanity. If you want to comment, please send your thoughts to ageoffission@gmail.com. That's AGEOFFISSION @gmail.com. To your host, Lonnie Clark.